All right, to continue with cell membranes and transport, I'm going to add a couple things into this one. Primarily, we're going to talk about active transport, but there were a couple little details because that last video got a little bit long that I left out that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned in this one. So that's why you still see some of this up here. When we're talking about cRNA in terms of cells, know that we're talking specifically with red blood cells and the term cRNA, okay? Lysis can be applied to both plant and animal cells, although typically in terms of plant cells, because they have a cell wall, they may not break open because the cell wall provides some structure to prevent that cell membrane from rupturing. Okay, so when we're talking about this, we're talking specifically about red blood cells, all right? And we focus on that because primarily that's where you're going to focus in this class because this is for health science majors, all right? The other thing I wanted to point out here that I didn't mention, specifically when we were talking about the use of a protein in helping, in this case, something that's polar, like water, move across a cell membrane, all right? When you involve a protein in it, it's referred to as facilitated diffusion, okay? Now, the example I give you is with water. So it's correct also to say that this would be the process of osmosis because we're following water movement. But you can have facilitated diffusion with other molecules within the cell if it's a large molecule that the cell wants to bring in from the outside or release from the inside of the cell as well, okay? So it's not just water that will move through a protein. You can have other things like sugar, glucose, can move across via facilitated diffusion to bring that sugar into the cell easily because that sugar is going to be the basis for generating the energy within the cell. And I know we haven't talked about the details on that, but just I wanted to make that part clear, okay? And in terms of active transport now, all right? Active transport, we're going to need to put in energy. And in order for something to move across the cell membrane, in the case of active transport, we are always going to be going now against our concentration gradient. Which is going to mean you've got more of something on one side than you do on the other. Okay? And in terms of that, the protein that I'm going to talk about specifically in this example is the sodium potassium ATPase. All right, that sodium potassium ATPase is going to become something that you're going to become much more concerned about in A&P1 when you talk about the nervous system. But what I'm going to talk about today is just how the ions are moving across the cell membrane. Don't worry about why they have to move this way, all right? But what ends up happening in this case is we want to set up a more severe gradient in order for action potentials in the case of the sodium potassium ATPase and nervous system to function. So what that means is we're going to move things against their concentration gradient. So in this case, we're going to take potassium and we want to move it into the cell We'll make sodium the circle here, like that. And what we're going to do is move it against the concentration gradient. All right? We've got more sodium outside than we do inside, but that pump now is going to move even more sodium out of the cell, more potassium in. Okay? In order to get that reaction to happen, this is where ATP has to be put into the system. ATP, or the energy, is needed to move things against a concentration gradient. And that's what we're doing with active transport. Okay? So in terms of that, the molecular active transport that I have in the PowerPoints, this is what I'm talking about with molecular active transport. You're talking about moving usually ions like sodium and potassium against their concentration gradient. So in this case, we'd move sodium out of the cell, we'd move potassium into the cell. Okay? And that's why the energy needs to be put in. That's why ATP is needed. Okay? There are a couple other examples of active transport, and I've got a couple other videos that I've posted to kind of show you how endocytosis and exocytosis work, because it happens in 3 dimensions, and I think the video is better for showing that than what I can draw on the board. Excuse me. But in terms of endocytosis, all right, you're looking at taking things into the cell. Exocytosis, too many T's and O's there. Exocytosis is going to move large molecules out of the cell. Okay? And I've got a video that shows that better than what I can draw. All right? But in terms of that endocytosis, that also you may see in older textbooks tagged as phagocytosis. And really what it's talking about with phagocytosis is bringing something from the environment into the cell. Okay? So what the cell membrane does is it kind of extends and sends out processes, brings something into the cell by creating a little vessel with the contents that are made up of the extracellular environment. Okay? So in terms of that endocytosis, we're bringing things into the cell. You may also see that as phagocytosis or cell eating, pinocytosis as cell drinking. So bringing things from extracellular to intracellular. Exocytosis typically is always moving products that the cell has made out, all right? Whether they be other proteins, whether they be other molecules, you're moving that from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, okay? Endocytosis, exocytosis, these are also types of active transport. You need ATP to be put into that process in order for endocytosis and exocytosis to happen, okay? So just to summarize, our passive types of transport are diffusion. A specific type of diffusion is facilitated diffusion if we use a protein. If we're talking about just moving across the cell membrane, it's diffusion. Osmosis, also talking about movement across a cell membrane, but with osmosis we're talking specifically water moving across a cell membrane, all right? And that water moving across the cell membrane is important because of the tonicity associated with the cell membrane, okay? So those are our passive types of transport. No ATP is required. ATP, or energy, is required for our active transport. So our molecular active transport, when I was talking about movement of sodium and potassium, With active transport, we're always talking about going against the concentration gradient. So you're going from an area of low concentration to high concentration, all right, which is the opposite of what we had with passive, and that's why you need energy put in. So we've got molecular active transport, and then we've got movement of larger molecules via endocytosis and exocytosis, where the whole cell membrane kind of is involved in that process. It folds in to bring things into the cell, or it buds off to release things from the cell, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, please let me know.